Before I begin, I feel it is necessary to point out that the news arm of the BBC has yet to retract, apologize, or otherwise address the deeply transphobic reporting it has engaged in the last few months. In a pinned comment down below, you'll find my original video on the topic, several videos from the YouTuber Sean, who has been ongoing in his pursuit of trying to get the BBC to own up to what they have done, and also a video from Laura Kate Dale showing the protests that have taken place outside of the BBC offices. While I don't feel any of the people behind Doctor Who are in any way responsible for this, I cannot in good conscience talk about a BBC-owned property without mentioning this first, until such time as it is properly redressed. Thank you. You know, I've always hated riding the bus. Continuing on with my rewatch of Series 11, and we've arrived at Rosa. Now, this is an episode that I already have a little bit of an odd history with, because this isn't technically a second review on it. This is a third. When the episode first came out, I gave my initial thoughts after watching it, and I was mixed about it. And something just wasn't sitting right with me. Once I realized what that was, I made a second video following up on that. And so since then, I haven't come back and watched it again. And I know a lot of people really, really love this episode. So I'm going to be honest, I was nervous to kind of come back and see how well my thoughts on it previously, both my initial and my secondary thoughts, actually held up. And some of them do, and those that are a little bit more iffy, I'm like, I do get why I felt that way. I suppose the main thing that I'm going to want to address, we'll get to it when I start talking about that part of the episode, is the ending and the fact that the Doctor and the companions are on the bus just to watch. So I had some very strong feelings about that around the time that it aired, but we'll get back to that. My overall opinion on this episode is that it is incredibly well-meaning. The actress who plays Rosa is very good, but it's still kind of clunky in its execution. I appreciate a lot of what it's doing, and some of it is even done well, but other parts of it just feel off. Some of it's little logistical touches, some of it's stuff that, like, just as a storyteller, setting any message or intent behind the story aside, that's just like, wait, what? Why would you do that? And then there's just how deliberate many of the bits of information being conveyed feel. And what I mean by that is, it feels very much at times like a school lesson. And I want to be very specific about that. I'm not saying that in a way that it seems like it's being patronizing or that I think it is talking down to its audience. That's not what I mean, which is often what people tend to mean when they say something sounds like a lecture or anything along those lines. But between the Doctor at one point busting out a pen to write on a wall the specific date, and she literally says,
"What do you remember about Rosa from school?"
It feels like a course refresher more than anything else. And unfortunately, this is kind of reiterated with the way the information of what happened to Rosa after her arrest on the bus is delivered.
And in June 1999, Rosa receives the Congressional Medal from President Clinton.
Which again is just the Doctor telling the companions in a way that I practically expect her to say at the end, "Now I hope you are all taking notes. This will be on the quiz." Again, I'm not saying that it's bad because it's patronizing. I'm saying it's awkward because it just doesn't feel like part of a narrative. It doesn't feel integrated. It feels like, let's pause the narrative to deliver all of the main bullet points from a history lesson. And that's not necessarily against the spirit of Doctor Who, at least in theory, because the show was originally conceived as something to be somewhat educational, but it still isn't integrated or executed particularly smoothly. That having been said, the general idea of really dealing head on was something that Doctor Who, New Who in particular, has largely kind of dodged, which is just the issues of some of these companions ending up in some of the time periods they do, and that's potentially a problem. It's dodged around with episodes like, say, the Shakespeare Code. It's addressed a little bit in terms of something like, say, human nature and the family of blood, but honestly, it's only a couple of lines there referring to Martha's race. It seems to largely be a class thing since the friend that she has, who's also a maid, is white. Like the most head on that Doctor Who, modern era Doctor Who, well, classic Doctor Who really never dealt with it, full stop. But the closest that modern Doctor Who has come to dealing with, I would say, was Thin Ice. But even then, it was largely around just the villain and one more thing to hate that guy over. And while I did really like that, and I will never get tired of watching that guy get punched in the face, it wasn't really a core, essential part of the story. Again, while the dude was a racist, for the most part, his issue seemed to be classism, as he thought, well, anybody of any race is disposable if they are of less means than me. So this is really dealing with the racism of the past much more head on, which I don't think that's a bad thing to try and do, especially given that the show's really gone out of its way to kind of dodge dealing with that fully, properly, directly. The closest it's come has been a ton of allegorical stuff, sure, with alien races and situations, etc., but let's deal with the reality. I can respect the idea, certainly. There are just some odd moments that just feel off to me. So, like, for example, when the fam first run into Rosa Parks and they hear her name, the fact that they all squee vocally at her.
Rosa Parks.
No way.
You're kidding.
Brilliant. Rosa Parks. Lovely to meet you, Rosa Parks. Big fan.
3/4 of the TARDIS team just going in this whole sort of fangirl mode vocally to her face. To me, it's just, it's uncomfortable. And also, it just reads weird. Like, my gut instinct is to be like, trust your actors to just put it on the face. Like, they're going to be like, yeah, no, really pleased to meet you. And then the instant she's out of earshot, being like, oh my God, that was Rosa Parks. To have them just blurt it out, just, again, it feels clunky. It feels like an awkward way to do something that, like, there's better ways to do that.
Oh, and just so we're clear, it's bad when any doctor does this.
Charles Dickens, you're brilliant, you are. Completely 100% brilliant.
Agatha Christie, I was just talking about you the other day. I said, I bet she's brilliant.
The conversation between Yaz and Ryan in the alley is not quite as clunky and on the nose as, say, the fangirling moment or the sort of school lesson sort of moments, but it's not that far off as well. And, like, here's the thing. The points that they bring up, all super valid. And I can buy that the essence of the conversation that they're having is very reasonable. That in these circumstances, this is the kind of conversation and the kinds of points that these characters would have. You know, I can't believe we're dealing with this. Things did get better, but man, not as much better as they should have. Like, well, you know, in so much time, this stuff will get better. Where will we be after that? So, like, if you were to bullet point out the things brought up in the conversation, I go, awesome, go write that conversation. But it's not a very well in flowing conversation. It still works a little bit better than sort of the school lesson moments, because I at least buy that under the circumstances where they are, they would be having that conversation at that time. It's just, it feels like it's dealing with bullet points for here are the things we need to be sure get addressed and said, but the actual move to turn it into a conversational bit of dialogue, that step wasn't taken. And there are little moments that sort of give me glimmers of, like, what would have felt more natural and conversational. Like, at the very end of that interaction in the alley, Yaz says,
"Must be my Mexican blood."
And that feels much more natural because it's bringing up, again, the fact that to these people, these racist white people, they don't really care whether she's Mexican or Pakistani or anything else. They can tell she's not just black, but other than that, like, lump them all together. Who cares? And that's a bit of conversational dialogue that, like, okay, that makes and brings up the point without flatly saying the point. Because the clunky way to say that would have been for her to go, well, at least they're not confusing you for a different race. They keep saying I'm Mexican. Like, well, yeah, we saw that. But by having it be that line of must be my Mexican blood, it's referencing this thing, reminding us of this thing, making this point, but it's like actual dialogue. The other thing that actually I think was integrated actually very well and incredibly naturally and conversationally were the references to Grace. So that gets brought up after they sort of have their little classroom session in the hotel, but they talk about her then with Graham and Ryan, and that conversation feels perfectly natural.
She had a t-shirt that said, Spirit of Rosa. I wish that she was here.
I don't. She'd start a riot.
That is the warmth, natural, conversational sort of feel that I wish had been injected into. I don't know if it could have been injected into every bit of these interactions I'm talking about, but more of them, because that does something that is a bullet point, which is bring up Grace, the fact that these two are still in mourning over her, and how she influenced both of their perspectives on civil rights and the past and things like that. It accomplishes that bullet point in a way that is naturally delivered in a flowing bit of dialogue that makes sense for the characters and feels like a real conversation. And I wish that was true of more of these moments and these scenes. Now, I know there's a lot of people who kind of complain about Krasco, the villain. So here's the thing. The core idea of him, I actually think is fine. There's a lot of weird little tiny logistical things that, like, do not track with him at all. And I'll get to those in a second. But I've seen a lot of people mock the idea, basically calling him a space racist. Here's the thing, though. If you're trying to make the argument like people that far in the future wouldn't still be racist, why not? Racism isn't rational. It's not logical. Its existence is emotional. Why would we assume that people wouldn't still have misguided emotional thoughts? You know, it's like people who argue there'll be no religion in the future. Like, why not? Will religion have to evolve and change in some way? Yeah, probably. But why would people simply stop having faith? And I'm kind of the same way, like, why would people simply stop being racist? Now, the percentage of people being racist, ideally, will continue to drop, but there's always going to be some. By logic, like at this point, we know scientifically there is no difference between races. It is a social construct. There is the visible difference of skin tone, and there is the social difference of cultural background, but at a core basic genetic level, there is no real significant difference. We know that. We have known that for a long time. Racism doesn't suddenly go away. So I have no problem with the idea of someone from the future who is not only still racist, but is going to have this thinking of, it was when you people stepped out of your lane and didn't know your place anymore. That's where everything went wrong, so that's what I'm going to change. That, honestly, if you've ever had a conversation with someone with very messed up racial thinking, and if you have had that conversation, you have my sympathy. But if you've ever had a conversation with somebody like that, that train of thought is not as outlandish as it seems. So I have no issues with him in concept. In execution, there's a whole bunch of logistical nuts and bolts that, like, don't track at all. So, like, for instance, let's take both his weapon and the neural restrictor that's supposed to stop him from hurting people. Okay, so thing number one, this weapon that he has that just blasts people into the past. So that is something that when he tries to shoot the doctor with it later on, he gets one shot off and then it overheats. But earlier, we saw him firing shot after shot after shot at them, and they had to run away. So this thing is crazy inconsistent for a start. And then with the whole neural restrictor thing, I understand logistically why it's there. They had to explain why he didn't just kill Rosa Parks when he got here. And so they basically give him the chip that Spike had in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He's like, you can't, hurt people. Except, like, he was firing that time-displacing weapon at the Doctor and the companions with intent. So if he can fire it at them, then he should be able to fire it at Rosa. And I'm guessing that must be indirect enough. Like, that doesn't strictly kill them, but it could send them to a time period where other things might kill them. Who knows? So, like, there's that. So if he can fire it at them, why can't he fire it at her? That doesn't really track. By and large, Krasko as a character feels, and the specifics about him feel reverse engineered, which is something I've already kind of brought up about the feeling of this series in general, which is it feels like they went from a point of, okay, we're going to do something on Rosa Parks. Someone's trying to disrupt history and stop Rosa Parks from being arrested on that bus because of what it kicks off from there. So if that's what they decided the pitch was, then they would have had to go, okay, so why wouldn't this person have just killed them? Well, then we'll have to put some neural restrictions in their head. Okay, but if even with that, if they're just trying to disrupt history, there's so many things that they could do that we still need to get rid of them somehow. Okay, what if we have them with a time-displacing weapon that Ryan could use on them? I'll come back to that. And like, it all just feels like starting from a case of, well, if we want to do this story, we need this, this, and this. We need to make sure this, this, and this doesn't happen and block this and this from being possibilities. And then put that information into the writer's room and poof, you get Krasko. He doesn't feel like these elements of his character are thought out beyond how does this allow the story to happen. And strictly speaking, that's not a problem in and of itself. It's not a problem that it is reverse engineered, and it might not be, honestly. I'm kind of presuming. The issue is that it feels that way. This is what is sometimes referred to as seeing the hand of the author, where it's not the decisions themselves that are the issue, but it feels like a decision made by a writer rather than a natural progression of character or story. So you see the hand of the author being like, and adjust that. There we go. Cool. Keep going. So that's kind of the issue going on with him. Now, I said I'd come back to Ryan and the weapon. First of all, why does the Doctor explain to Ryan how this thing works? Like in the hotel, he asks how it works, and she literally tells him how to use it.
Charge is here. This setting dials the temporal destination. Pretty simple, pretty deadly. Now, can we concentrate?
What? Why did you tell him how to use that? And then he does use it. And more to the point, he uses it. He blasts Krasko back to the Stone Age, for all we know. And this never, ever comes up again. Not even really in this episode. A companion takes a weapon that the Doctor earlier explicitly said she does not like, and it's a nasty piece of work, and who explicitly says to him, don't touch that, uses it to blast a villain into the far distant past, which that is a bad thing. Like, that's what the Weeping Angels do. So if you're just trying to frame that as a heroic or acceptable alternative to just killing him, I'm not sure that tracks with the associations of that kind of action. And then he just tells the Doctor, yeah, I did that, and it never, ever comes up again. I've got a big problem with that. And like, I'm not going to say what should have come of that. Whether the Doctor should have started distrusting Ryan. I don't think Krasko should have like somehow come back because he wasn't strictly killed by that move or anything like that. But that feels like that should have some kind of consequences on the interpersonal relationships of the characters, if nothing else. But it doesn't. The Doctor doesn't even react. And like, if the Doctor had had some reaction, even if she like had this sort of little sideways knowing glance or something, maybe I could have headcanoned it where she kind of wanted him to do this, but didn't want to say it outright. And it's like a little bit of that 10th Doctor, manipulating people against their own interest, or to do the thing that like you're not, you don't want to do on your own, that he did every now and then. Well, some doctors have, but like 10th went on about the fact that he did that a bit. So I can't even headcanon that because there isn't the wiggle room to do it. So it doesn't bother me that Ryan did it. It bothers me that there is zero fallout and zero consequences to that. On him as a character, on his relationship with the doctor, practically, logistically, no consequences to that. What? And when I say consequences, I'm not saying like Ryan needed to be punished. But as I said, this mirrors something done by villainous beings that are some of the scariest things in Doctor Who. The Doctor said specifically she hates these weapons. She has chided people already for picking up weapons or kicking people off of cranes, and she has no reaction to this. It's just like, what? What is going on? So now we're kind of getting towards the stuff where I had very complicated feelings before. So first off, I actually find it interesting, and I'm not sure if it's inherently good or bad, but it is interesting that the way this episode is constructed, it is kind of saying that the bad people of history are just as important as the heroes of history. Because it's not enough to ensure that Rosa got on that bus. It had to be James Blake driving. Now, you could make the argument that it was about specifically preserving the timeline in as complete a sense as possible, but the ultimate outcome of that is, well, the villain of the moment needed to be there in order for the hero of the moment to have what happened. And that's interesting to me. I don't think it's making any sort of deliberate or moral judgment around that. It's just kind of an interesting acknowledgement. I kind of like it. But then we get to the very end, where the Doctor and the companions are on the bus to witness all this. Now, let me back up and sort of summarize my issues with this previously. My problem that I had, that I settled on, because when I did my initial review, I didn't quite know why it was sitting so badly with me. And then when I did the second video because I figured it out. What I realized was it made me deeply uncomfortable and deeply unhappy that the episode could, I don't believe this was ever an intention, could be read as the people who were not the oppressed having to just sit there and bear witness, but not help. And yes, I understand logistically they couldn't help, timelines and all that. But my issue was that ultimately, pull the logistics of the story aside, what is happening? The people with privilege sit by and watch as the people struggling and oppressed pull themselves up. Don't help, just observe. And that just reminded me of the most infuriating kind of allyship, where people stand at the sides and go, we're rooting for you, but do nothing. That is not meaningless, but it's not enough, and it's not what's needed. And at the time, to put it in more specific context, the weekend that I saw this episode was the same weekend that then President Trump implemented it as official federal guidelines to treat gender as something assigned at birth and immutable and unchangeable. Now, this didn't change national policy, but within federal institutions, federal government offices were instructed by him and his administration to treat gender that way. And that set me off a bit. So seeing people like me directly targeted was not a good time for me to watch an episode where I came away with the feeling that the people who could be doing something were choosing not to, and that was depicted as noble. I was not okay with that. Rewatching it now, some years later, there is an aspect of it that I think I didn't give its due credit that kind of counterbalances that old read that I had, which is that it's not just that they're not sitting there for the heck of it. Their presence is a manner of helping, because if they don't stay there, the bus isn't full enough for the bus driver to demand that Rosa Parks give up her seat. And so this is kind of the middle ground that I think, under the circumstances, is the best that could be reached between we need to preserve this moment in history and we can't screw with it, but let's have the characters do something. It didn't really click with me before that in the very specific circumstances that these characters are in, the choice to even be there was still an active choice that did help and did make a difference. Now, I still worry that anybody might come away with even a subtextual feeling that simply being present and taking no action is enough in and of itself. That's not what I would want, but under the logistical constraints of the story they were telling, I think I felt that the characters were more passive than they actually are. Even that passivity that they have to sit there and watch it is something they have to choose to do, and to watch this happen is a pain they choose to experience. Is it in any way equal to what Rosa's going through? No! But the show doesn't pretend like it is either. So while I'm not going to say that my previous read and my more negative read on that moment specifically was wrong, it was very informed by stuff going on and my feelings about that stuff at the time, and it leaned me more firmly into a negative read than I think is entirely fair. And so I feel better about that moment now, certainly than I did when I did my second video on this some years ago. Now, that having been said, there are still a couple of other clunky bits towards the end. There's the Rise Up song that plays. It sort of starts playing, when Rosa's confronting the bus driver, through her arrest, and they keep it going after that. It's very on the nose. I'm kind of okay with it, though, if only because I like it better than the generically inspirational horn sting that they keep cutting in. Which sounds like something out of the friggin' West Wing, which I also hate the music from the West Wing. So, this is about the one time I can think that I'm really down on the music in the Chibnall and Whittaker era of Doctor Who. I don't like that. This generic inspirational horn sting. I hate it. It really, really, really bothers me. And it does not feel like it fits the moment at all. It feels like, again, the hands of the authors being like, super inspirational person, super inspirational moments. I'm like, yeah, let them be that. Don't give me this generic inspiration soundtrack. So I'm actually okay with the Rise Up song because as on the nose as that is, it's better than those frickin' horns were. So I don't mind that song too much. That said, choosing to end on the asteroid, I still think that's weird.
Asteroid 284996, also known as Rosa Parks.
The asteroid is real. There is really an asteroid named after Rosa Parks, and that is cool. It's just really strange to me that that's the last thing to note on. I guess they thought, well, it's spacey, and Doctor Who does space stuff, and we'll end on an image of it. I'm like, okay, but you're going for she was kind of an activist all her life. She was recognized as an icon for freedom. She got the Congressional Medal of Honor. Oh, and also there's a rock in space named after her. That's just a weird one to decide to be the last one, to decide to be the big inspirational thing, and to end on an image of a floating rock with the song going, rise up. And I'm like, what? Disconnect. Again, like, the fact that she has an asteroid named after her is cool. It's just a weird one to end on, at least to me. Oh, and one last thing about Rosa. Again, very well performed, and I do like that they acknowledge her interest and her history of being involved in early civil rights movements and leaders at the time. Even though, like, her being arrested on the bus wasn't planned, she was a part of that world. And I like that that's acknowledged, because a big part of the mistelling of history for a very long time, like the version I was told as a kid growing up, was that she was just a woman who was tired and wouldn't give up her dream. Like, no, she was someone who knew what was going on, knew what was wrong, and cared. Now, that didn't make this a planned, staged protest moment. It wasn't. But she was no stranger to the world of civil rights activism. And I like that that gets acknowledged here. That's well done. So I think I probably come away feeling better about this episode overall than I did, because my issues previously kind of ran through some of the deeper layers in terms of the way certain things are brought across and the messaging, particularly in that final bit. I'm now much more okay with those than I have been. There's still some logistical, like, what the hex, and it bothered me even at the time that there were no consequences to Ryan blasting Krasko, but it bothers me even more now because I now have the hindsight of knowing it never comes up again, ever. And that is bizarre to me. Oh well. Rosa, I think I come away liking it overall a little bit better than I did previously, which is nice. What do you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. Patreon. That's how I pay the bills and keep this whole operation up and running. Any amount is of great help, but don't worry about it too much. All the other stuff helps me out as well. There's other things that I do, or merch, or books that I've written, etc. Links in the description, but don't worry too much about any of it. Because what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You're the council, I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned.
And credits. I got to shout out my top Patreon supporters, so thank you very much to Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, Oliver B, Melinda Walters, Leotha Boyd, TT, Bernobulax the Poodle, Eidolon, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Angry Caspero, Adam Lefty Taylor, Shane Ross, Robin Moore, Shayla Gourlay, and Brendan LaRose. Couldn't do it without you.